Thanks, everyone. We're excited to join you today for what we hope feels more like a conversation than a formal presentation. We will use some slides to anchor the discussion, but our main focus is going to be on a question that a lot of organizations are wrestling with right now. In this era of AI, automation, workforce transformation, how do organizations manage through that change and what actually helps those changes stick? We'll go through a couple of introductions. Just you already heard from Connor a little bit about us, but Chantal is going to bring that global client success lens. I'll turn it over to her to talk about why this topic is of importance right now.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks for the intros, Connor. We're excited to be here today. As previously mentioned, I come to the table with 15 years of experience in customer success, and what that translates into is thousands of conversations with prospects and customers in the pre-sale and post-sale life cycle. And I am, graced with the opportunity to have conversations about different organizational priorities, about challenges, about opportunities that different HR leaders and other executive stakeholders are confronted with on the daily. And so when we are having these discussions, a lot of the topics are centering around AI. And it's not just AI as a technology that's being implemented, it's AI and transformation and the pace at which they're moving. And then the undercurrent and the underlying factor that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, that human element. Like, how do you help people adapt and build confidence and change behavior in a sustained way that allows these transformational initiatives to be successful? And that's where we think recognition becomes more of a strategic lever than some leaders might initially assume.
Thank you. And from my perspective, I get the privilege of working in a Wordco Center of Excellence as a practitioner and in same but different conversations, really helping people redesign those programs. My background spans across multiple functions within HR and specifically working like among deskless and complex organizations. So excited to jump in today. We're going to start with an audience poll. Since we are a recognition company, we're going to start with this question. What has been the most meaningful form of recognition you've experienced professionally? We'll have that pop up, and you can select which one is most meaningful for you all. All right. Bronson, will the results just show up automatically? Perfect. Awesome. So it looks like about 30% say recognition from a senior leader, most meaningful. Almost tied, 29% specific praise from a manager. Monetary's a little bit lower on the list, but still important. Company swag, bottom of the list.
Yeah, I can't underestimate the power of receiving that recognition from a senior leader. When I think about one of my favorite recognition moments professionally, I think about my 3-year anniversary celebration, and my manager at the time took the time to corral a bunch of speakers and did this like little mini meeting with some of my favorite treats and just an opportunity for different peers and co-collaborators to come together. And was, a little uncomfortable if you don't like the spotlight, but they all got to share stories about what it's been like working with me over the last 3 years, and it was a really special moment, and at the helm was the leader who took the time to bring that moment to life, so that was really special. Is there a moment that stands out for you, Kelly?
Yeah, I love that. I love the special touches that they did. Yeah, for me, it was a company award actually. I had built a team, a people analytics team from scratch in an organization that hadn't had it before first year had some very, very aggressive goals, and the team just worked super, super hard. And then they were recognized with one of the, very exclusive company awards, and they got to go up on stage at the annual celebration. They got a little trophy. So that was really cool to see how proud they were and how proud I was of them getting that. And then to see the little trophies sitting on their desk was really cool as well.
Oh, I love that your example isn't necessarily about, like, receiving the recognition, but bearing witness to other people being celebrated for their achievements. Yeah, there's an infectious, like, in a positive way, effect that happens to witnessing that recognition.
Yeah, I would have been on the stage, but I joined remotely, so I was kind of like, oh, watching from a distance, which was kind of fun. But yeah, it was awesome.
Amazing.
All right. So as we dive into the content today, we wanted to highlight a tension that we keep hearing in the market. Leaders absolutely believe that recognition matters, but there's a lot of priorities on the table right now with AI strategy, transformation planning, redesigning work, all of the fun things we all get to keep hearing about. So sometimes it gets pushed down the list. So Chantal, I'd love to see, how are you seeing that show up in the conversations that you're a part of?
Yeah, I think that reprioritization, like, I think you hit the nail on the head there. This is something that is showing up in a couple ways. We're seeing some customers deciding to stall or reprioritize different implementations of different program strategies. And then we also see some prospects who initiated some conversations around exploring what bringing to life a recognition strategy could look like and deciding we're going to punt this decision down the road right now because we don't have the capacity or the calories to implement an enterprise-wide recognition solution. And I think they're framing it in through the lens of competition for resources or bandwidth, attention, potentially some fear around the tax on people's capacity to digest and metabolize and absorb so much change.
Yeah, I think those tensions are real. As a practitioner, you only have so many resources, as well as an employee, right? They only have so much attention to respond to all the changes and the existing recurring programs that happen as the employee life cycle goes on. So let's hear a little bit from the audience. We're going to do two back-to-back polls to get a sense of where they are. So
Yeah.
for first one, in terms of AI and workforce transformation, which statement best describes your organization right now? And we'll have a couple options pop up on the screen for you guys to choose from.
Yeah, so those options are we're still planning and designing what transformation should look like. We are making changes, but adoption is inconsistent. We're seeing progress, but culture and engagement feels fragile. Or we have the strategy, but behavior change is still the hardest part.
And of course, we know some of these are overlapping, but just pick the one that closest matches to where you are today. Where would you put Awardco on this list?
Hmm. I think I'd say maybe like we're making changes, but adoption is inconsistent, but with some grace there, because a little later we'll talk about the ways that Awardco is approaching AI, and I think there's been a lot of positive momentum and a lot of scaffolding and infrastructure in place to support the change. So maybe I'd probably put it in there with some caveats.
Yeah. Next. All right. Let's see what the rest of the audience has to say. Ooh, a lot are still in the planning and designing what the transformation should look like.
Yeah, that adoption being consistent, and then it is change. Behavior change is tricky. Yeah, I think what stands out for me is that while these stages, we've categorized them separate and they kind of fit neatly into their own box, I think that there is this through thread in all of them and this underpinning, which is when you're designing transformation or you're going through large scale change, like the rollout is difficult, but the harder part is helping people understand what is changing, what the expectations are, what success looks like in practice, and then that like sustainment to keep that meaningful momentum going. Let's spend we'll spend some time talking about that. I think we have one more poll before we do that.
Yes, we do. And we'll get into the human side of it too, which I think is really interesting as well. All right. So the next poll is going to be around what extent does recognition feel like it's taking a backseat to these other initiatives at your organization? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We'll get a sense of where the audience is with that.
Let's walk through these buckets a little bit. So, your options, not at all. Recognition is being treated as part of the transformation strategy. A little. Recognition still matters, but it's not getting much focus. Quite a bit. Transformation initiatives are getting most of the attention, or completely. Recognition has largely been pushed to the sidelines. This is a safe zone, judgment free zone.
Should we give a spoiler alert for us or we'll wait?
Let's wait.
Wow.
Ooh,
I'm
love
so
that.
sorry. I love that. We have a
Well, we
tie.
can end it here. We can end the webinar here. Everyone understands the importance of recognition. We're done. Just kidding. That's great to see. That's exciting.
Wow. I love that only 9% have it completely sidelined for the time being. Awesome.
Hey, this is
Okay.
promising. Yeah.
Well, we'll dive into the next section where we'll introduce a little bit of a hot take that sounds like maybe not so much of a hot take now. Um, so, for us, there's no doubt that the work around AI adoption, redesigning how work gets done, it's definitely here to stay. That work, according to Gallup and other reputable research companies out there, has doubled in the last 2 years. So, it's definitely not going away. But what if instead of pushing recognition aside to focus on this new way of working, companies doubled down on it instead? What do you think would happen if organizations treated recognition as more of a driver of change instead of something that's competing with that change?
Yeah. I think technology or change at scale can result in the changing of workflows. It can change processes, but change in and of itself won't create the human compliance in through the shape of like adoption. So there is still this important realization that our people still have to learn. They need to experiment. They need to share. They need to adapt. They need to collaborate in new ways. And recognition is a strategic lever and in my opinion, one of the clearest ways to reinforce those behaviors at scale while the change is happening. So, at the heart of every change are humans, people with feelings and thoughts and impressions, perspectives about the effectiveness of the change. And during seasons of change, we want to make sure that we are holding up positive examples and reinforcing the behaviors that are in alignment and in accordance to what we're setting out to achieve.
I love that. As a self-proclaimed data nerd, I'm always going to want to see the kind of the business case behind recognition and how it can help drive that change. Can you share some of the insights from Awardco's research around how recognition can influence change?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2025, the Center of Excellence conducted a study across 2,000 employees and pulsed them on a bunch of different questions. And they were all relating to motivation, engagement, intent to stay, recognition, and a couple of other topics. And what we found was, especially during times of change, recognition isn't just a morale play. It is that strategic lever that supports engagement, retention, and resilience at the exact point, like that intersection where organizations are demanding a lot from their people. So, in the stats represented here, 2.3 times more likely to be engaged and 1.7 times more likely to want to stay.
That's awesome. And I think if organizations were to quantify these around against their own metrics, there's some real dollars in terms of cost avoidance through lower turnover, a reduction in lost productivity, fewer backfill disruptions, lower costs to backfill those employees. There's a lot of true ROI to be surfaced here.
Absolutely.
All right. I love the headline for this next section because it's so true. Every transformation is a behavior change initiative. It's tempting to think that these large scale changes are just about the technology, or you get so focused on, testing and rollout and all of the technical components of it. But really, where you're going to see success is how well it's adopted from a behavior standpoint. When you look at these behaviors, what do leaders most often underestimate?
Yeah. Before I get into the underestimate part, like I think talking through each of these would be helpful. So when you are going through transformation, you're going through change. The first step is making sure that your employees are learning, that they understand what fundamentally is different from the process that was originally in place or the process that wasn't in place. Then we want to encourage that experimentation. We want to foster and create that culture where people can fail fast, where they can tinker and really use that curiosity to fuel figuring out new ways of working, what works, what doesn't. And then, of course, there's going to be learnings. We make mistakes as we're learning new things. There's a learning curve. And so we share and we create a culture where there is this vulnerability and candor where we can learn from each other's mistakes, where we can iterate and really embody a culture that focuses on continuous improvement. And then we see organizations will set some sort of goals, some sort of measures of success, usually in the form of like a KPI or an OKR that then becomes that challenge that we're striving towards, that bar, if you will. And then there's that, again, that commitment to iteration and continuous improvement in the form of adaptation. You learn new things, you make decisions at a point of time based on a subset of information, but there's evolution in, fast changing business. And then you also want to foster that sense of collaboration. You're not doing things in a silo. You want to make sure that there's effective communication. And so those are like the pillars of behavior change. But what I think leaders often underestimate is how much reinforcement people need during periods of change. So I think there's a lot of initial like effort and energy at like the launch where we're communicating the initial message well, but communication alone isn't what's going to make the behavior repeatable. What people watch and what is noticed, what is recognized, what gets talked about serves as signals throughout your organization of what success looks like. There was this landmark study by Dr. Philippa Lawley at the University of London, and she talked about automaticity. And this is the idea of like how long before something really gets into us and becomes second nature. So it's just routine. We're not really thinking about it. It's no longer difficult. And there's this predictable curve, and what was found in this study is that reinforcement the number of reinforcements that are required for a change to be successful range from 18 to 250 times, depending where on the spectrum the complexity of the change sits. So if we're talking about an AI transformation, which I think for a lot of us was a lot to take in. Like it wasn't just these LLM tools, it wasn't just like a series of apps to tinker with. Like in a lot of organizations, it is deeply embedded in a lot of the tools and systems and processes that support the organizational infrastructure. And so when you think of this enterprise wide, touching every employee degree of or magnitude of change, we're looking at like 250 times of required reinforcement to have those habits stick. And when I think about that's a really heavy lift. And so if I am a person at the helm of that change, I can't shoulder that burden alone. And that's why a recognition platform becomes so useful and helpful because it becomes that place where those successes and the people who are embodying the values and the behaviors that we expect to see, they're held up as signals and flags and indicators to the rest of the organization. And those serve as these reinforcement moments so that a single administrator of a program or initiative isn't shouting from the rooftops or the stairwells or whatever forum that's appropriate within the organization of like, hey, these people are doing good jobs.
Yeah, I love that. I think what I've seen, one, that psychological safety piece is really critical, giving people the freedom to try things out that maybe they've never done before and admit, hey, this didn't go well. you know, I'm going to put this back on the shelf because it didn't go well versus we've invested this much money in it. We're just going to push through even though it's not proven to be successful. So
Mhm.
the opportunity to fail fast and admit if something didn't go as planned and adapt quickly is one of the things that I've really noticed, comes from, the culture of leadership. And so if the employees see that leaders are doing that and or recognizing people that are doing that, they're going to feel more comfortable and more safe to do that in their own roles. And then I love the idea of the challenge. I've seen some really cool challenges, AI hackathons and things at companies that really give everyone the opportunity to do something meaningful. And then some of the winners I've seen at previous organizations were from departments you would not have expected, communications or some of these departments you would think are more softer skills, and AI allows them to utilize their tacit knowledge in their function to create something that before they'd have to have IT resources to create. So that's a really cool opportunity. All right, we're going to go to the audience and hear from them on our last poll. Which behavior would be most valuable to reinforce more consistently in your organization right now? We have a couple options to choose from. We have learning new skills and capabilities, experimenting with new ways of working, sharing knowledge and best practices, challenging outdated habits or assumptions, adapting quickly to change, or collaborating across teams and functions. And I know a lot of us want a multi select for this, but
Mm.
we'll just have to choose the most valuable currently. Do you have one you would pick? It's hard to decide on this one, I think.
It it is a tricky one. Uh, I think that adapting quickly to change is so important, like being nimble and resilient, and I don't love the word pivot, but it's popping into my head, but because there is just this natural demand that things are gonna change, and you can't be precious about that change, so I think that adaptation is really important.
All right, let's see where things shook out. Ooh, challenging outdated habits or assumptions as the top one. That's
That's
very
good.
true.
Yeah.
The old, this is the way we've always done it.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
And I always like to see which one's the lowest. So the lowest is experimenting with new ways of working. That's good. So people are hopefully getting out there and seeing what's possible with all this new technology we have.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
All right. So this leads very well into our next topic, which is reinforcing behavior at scale. This is where recognition becomes more than just appreciation. It becomes a signal, a moment that tells people what matters at their specific companies and to their leaders. Can you unpack what it means to you in terms of reinforcing behavior at scale through recognition?
Yeah, I think it's when recognition is tied to a behavior or an organizational value, like collaboration or experimentation, learning agility, giving up old habits and trying something new. It's really doing two things at once. That recognition is acknowledging the individual contribution. So at heart, we're all humans. We want to ask the question, no, like, am I doing a good job? Am I doing what's necessary to continue to be successful? So it kind of sates that need, and then it also broadcasts to everyone else what success looks like in this new environment and helps with some of that reinforcement that we talked about a little bit.
I love that. I'm gonna pop over to our audience questions because we do have some questions coming into that we can um, trickle into this conversation. So, how can you encourage leaders to see the importance of recognition during these times of change?
It's
Any
a good question.
strategy?
Yeah. I think I think what's important is, like, taking inventory of where your organization is right now. So, we have tools like our engagement survey, we have other listening strategies. What are our people saying? Do they feel recognized? Do they feel like they have leadership that observes the work that they're doing? Like, I think there's the first step is taking inventory of current state. And once you can hold up examples through data like employee listening tools, then you can start to march towards, okay, how do we solve these things? Then you can start coupling and building a business case where you start to integrate different data points that talk about some of the benefits that we talked about, that increased engagement, that stronger intent to stay. And then you can look at it through the lens of, Are my administrators of programs spending a lot of heavy lifting and really shouldering the burden of what it takes to have some of these initiatives? Because whether you have a formal recognition platform or strategy in place, you're probably doing something within the walls of your organizations that's akin to a recognition strategy, and that's likely falling on the shoulders of choice few. So when you start to take inventory of your current state, take inventory of like what methods are working within the organization, then you can layer in components of like, how do we make this equitable? How do we make this scalable? How do we find the time saving that we're spending? How do we harmonize this across the organization? And couple that with some data from Awardco's research or other industry led research that talks about the connective tissue and what recognition influences. And then you can start building that business case to get in front of leaders and have it be part of the dialogue. Anything that you would add to that, Kelly?
Yeah, no, I love all of those suggestions. I also like to kind of tie it back to things like your employee engagement survey and how are you scoring from an employee perspective on things like recognition, adoption of change, things like that, and anywhere that you can kind of correlate that with your recognition behaviors to drive impact is also a way to get leaders' attention. So if you show them, maybe there's some low scoring items in their particular reporting structure around recognition, and then you implement some action planning, some changes according to that. And then the next year or the 6 months later, you see that goes up and how that impacts the other metrics that they might be tracking within the business, whether it's around safety or quality. Um, Really tying it back to the data that the leader cares about and helping them see those trends over time, that what they do does make a difference in those business outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another question here that feels closely linked, so maybe we can take that one too. The question was, our leaders know that recognition is important. It's just too much for them to think about with how fast AI is moving. What recommendations do you have for how we can help our leaders see that this isn't an additional load, but will help with that? Kelly, you want to kick us off on that one?
Yeah, I mean, a really practical example, I think once leaders know that it's important and it can have a business impact, is really just scheduling intentional time. Like whether it's 15, 20 minutes at the end of the week or at the end of a day to really think about, what impact has been had through your team for that week and even use AI to help you with that, right? If you have an internal AI tool that's connected to your systems, you can even ask it things like, what meaningful work has been done this week that I could potentially recognize to give you a head start. So really just setting aside doesn't even have to be a big amount of time, 10, 15 minutes to be intentional about that and then watch to see how grateful people are and how the behaviors change just by that small action.
Yeah, love that. Okay, cool. Should we hop back in and we'll visit some questions again a little bit later?
Yes. Either there was one I was gonna have just because I have it tagged here. The data of the 2.3 times more likely to be engaged, that's a WordCo's original research called the motivation machine. You can find that on our website more in detail if you want to dig into that. All right, let's talk about some more tangible examples. I'd love to hear your perspective on the Alera Group case study.
Yeah, first, I want to mention that while the topic du jour is AI, this example and some subsequent examples are coming through the frame of large scale change initiatives. So, whether that's AI, whether that's mergers and acquisitions, whether that's some enterprise scale fundamental change, I think the way that we talk about the key tenets that we're discussing here today apply across the board. So, Alera Group is a key player in the financial services sector. They specialize in delivery of retirement strategies, wealth management, insurance, and benefits. And they saw an opportunity to use recognition as a tool to promote harmonization and integration as they were confronted with staring down 24 mergers across 280 offices. And so the real story here is that recognition became part of the operating rhythm. It helped to unify people across complexity at the scale. It increased manager participation and it created a pattern of reinforcement that supported retention and engagement over time. So if we look at some of these metrics here, 170% increase in recognition adoption, 43% lower attrition risk among high participants, 9% higher retention for 2 recognitions if an employee received those, 188% increase in manager recognition activity, and about 80% higher branded item retention versus peers. And so the facts speak for themselves when you consider recognition as the underpinning or the foundation to build upon. It can have some pretty dramatic effect.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting to see that 80% higher branded item because I know we have also found branded items correlate higher to recognition. But it was funny in the poll earlier, the swag was at the bottom of
Yes.
the people don't know they want it, but it actually does help them feel closer to their company.
Yeah, totally. That's a good call out.
So if you were advising an organization going through, a large scale change, whether that's an integration, a merger, something like that, what do you think is the top lesson that they could take away from Alara's experience here?
Yeah, I think the key takeaway is don't wait until after the change to have an effect or impact on culture. Like use recognition during the change to use it as the foundation for building things like consistency, visibility, belonging while people are still finding their footing. It feels like parallel processing because they're complementary versus treating them as completely separate initiatives.
Awesome. So the next section, we're going to switch a little bit from process to a little bit of psychology. So during these changes, employees often have a lot of questions that leaders might not hear directly, but you'll hear it at the water cooler. um, and those feelings are going to help shape the employee experience during that time. So which one of these do you feel like feels most present to you?
I feel like I can't pick one. Like I feel like in so many organizations, all of them are showing up in some shape or form. People people care a lot about like whether they're valued, whether they belong, whether they're focusing on the right things and whether the work still matters. And especially during times of uncertainty or ambiguity, like you almost feel like you're not on stable footing, and so some of that insecurity might feel a little spiked. And so recognition serves as like that reinforcement, not only for helping propel change initiatives, but it's also to imbue people with that confidence that they're doing the right thing and hold up the assurances and validation that they're on the right track.
Yeah, I totally agree. And even if your particular company isn't going through massive changes right now, I think the headlines out there are enough to bring these questions to light for everyone, around do they belong? What does success look like now? Because it kind of feels like everything's changing and we're all trying to play a little catch up, right?
Absolutely.
So, can you share some examples of how leadership is handling these things at a Wordco specifically?
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about how Awardco is tackling AI. So internally at Awardco, we spent a lot of front-loaded time really thinking about and curating a strategy to support our AI adoption. So we use a tool called Glean, and to ensure our successful adoption and like to make sure that we sustain momentum and enthusiasm, we started by creating a Slack channel called Gleaning In, which is quite fun. And we use that to share insights, successes, questions. So when we talked about that psychological safety and failing fast, that became a conduit for some of those discussions and conversations. We rolled out a few learning courses in our LMS to ensure that we had common language and common understanding of expectations and how AI is showing up in our work, and really make sure that there was eliminating and chipping away at some of that ambiguity of what success looks like. During our weekly all hands meeting, we spotlight recognitions that highlight people who are successfully leveraging AI or people who have seen material results. Not in all cases though, because there's something to be said about celebrating that messy middle. Like as you are going through it, there's a lot of opportunity there to be like, I see you, like you're working really hard. While it hasn't reached its like culmination in the end, there's still a lot to be recognized in what I like to call the messy middle. And then during team meetings, we are encouraging leaders to spend some time highlighting and celebrating wins or fail fast moments within their team, again, to create that sharing and that dialogue and have that communal sense of learning. And we're also hosting a hackathon just later next week, actually, where we asked all departments and we kind of democratize access to agents and skill building. And we're like, hey, we're going to host a hackathon. Folks like open season on tinkering with the tools and seeing if you can build or design an agent or a skill that will have a demonstratable impact to the organization in terms of efficiency or streamlining a process or finding a smarter way to tackle a challenge. And those are going to be showcased and voted on for a myriad of different awards, and they'll be spotlighted in our award code platform. So a lot of different tools and resources and approaches, but at its core, it's about celebrating the big and small moments, the failures and the wins, and using tools and meeting people where they are is really important. So, like I mentioned Slack, that's our communication tool, our LMS system. Like, where's that connective tissue or those integration opportunities to make sure it's within our employees' ecosystem and we're keeping it top of mind within those forums.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. From my perspective, I've been a part of companies that sort of made the tool available and rolled out training that felt a lot more like a set of rules that made people more scared to access the tool. Like, don't do this, don't do that, make sure you don't do this. That kind of created a lot of fear. So
Yeah.
I love the approach at Awardco. The Gleanian channel is one of my favorite channels to go and see. I just like to read through and see what other people are doing. It like spurs ideas for me. And then I was one of the lucky winners early on that got highlighted in the company meeting, and I'm not gonna lie, it did encourage me to keep
Yeah.
trying. I felt like it was like, "Hey, that wasn't even that good. I can do a lot better things than that." I was just getting started. So that recognition and the leadership acknowledging it was very motivating.
That's awesome.
I was on a webinar yesterday that was talking about how AI is reshaping organizational networks, and one of the findings they had from some of their research was if your manager is a power user of AI, and how they defined power user was using it 4 times a week or more,
Mm.
the employees were 2 times as likely to also be a power user. And I thought that was super interesting. And the same rang true for peers. If your peer group that you work with most frequently is a power user, you're also 2 times more likely to be a power user. So, any way to create visibility into, what people are doing, I think it's just going to spread even faster.
Yeah. I want to pop over to a question here because I feel like it melds well into what we're talking about. But the question is, should AI recognize employees based only on measurable outcomes, or should it also account for behaviors such as teamwork, creativity, and leadership? And how could this be done fairly? I have a thought, and then Kelly, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. There is a lot of dynamic capability within recognition strategies where you can leverage non-monetary or monetary recognition. And so in my mind, how I'd maybe initially think about this would be if I'm recognizing a value, so like teamwork or a guiding principle or tenet, like teamwork, creativity, or leadership, and I want to be sincere in commending the efforts in alignment with living that like company ethos. I might approach that through non-monetary recognition as like, well done, this still deserves a shout out. And then maybe I would reserve monetary recognition or something that has some sort of appended tangible value to something that has measurable metrics driven outcomes would be like my first way of categorizing that. And granted, there's nuance and context that we could think through, but how are you thinking about that, Kelly?
Yeah, I totally agree. Both are equally as important to recognize for different reasons. I think it can tie into also your total rewards philosophy and strategy around, some companies have a totally non monetary recognition program and they save the measurable outcome compensation for bonus plans that are separate from recognition. So I think it can be structured in many ways. One of the companies I worked at started just to create a culture of recognition, 100% non-monetary for a couple years to like just reinforce both behaviors, measurable outcomes, as well as those values. So
Yeah.
I agree. There's lots of ways to do it, but definitely, I think the culture would suffer if you're only recognizing everything measurable outcome. You need to have things because it doesn't just matter what you do, how you get it done and how you treat people certainly matters as well.
Yeah, effort is part of that equation for sure. Okay, cool.
All right. So let's jump into another case study. We have some information here about Paramount, and this story kind of broadens the conversation from individual confidence to organizational consistency. This was about building one culture across a global workforce. So, what stands out to you most in this example?
Yeah, I think what stands out to me here is that there was this pursuit of consistency and equity when you have a business that scales different countries across the globe, you want to make sure that you're focusing on an equitable global experience. And to do that in a practical way that connects people across geography, structure, local context, a recognition platform is a great way to help realize some of that and make sure that you're leveraging different tools to make sure that all employees are being afforded with the opportunity to have an equitable experience. I feel like I said that word a lot of times, but at its core, that's what stands out to me.
Yeah, I love that. The companies where I've worked where we didn't have a formal recognition platform, but yet we were trying to quantify recognition's going to happen with or without a platform. You just might not have the same visibility into it. The kind of employee stories aren't going to be as easy to highlight. So we were constantly like doing a lot of manual effort to chase down what was happening, what was the good work happening in different pockets, and what putting a vendor in did was a lot better visibility into that, so then we could look at the data and see was it equitable or not. Prior to that, we just had no way of even looking at that information.
That's a great call out.
All right, let's talk about cultural drift for a minute. Um, so in periods of change, it's easy to focus just on systems or structure while missing what's happening to that shared identity. Again, we talked a little bit about even if your particular organization isn't going through change, the world is, and the headlines are there. So organizations may or may not be going through changes of their own, but over time, some of this cultural drift can start to happen. Um, so what do you think leaders should be equipped to talk through to kind of help their employees when this drift starts to happen?
Yeah, I think though you start to spot it, like there's when there's a lot of change, whether that's people change, technology change, just a lot tackling a lot of change, like I think you start to see an erosion and like a lack of clarity that materializes in this form of inconsistency, and so what was once valued and maybe was, like, held up as a strong pillar, there's, like, this weaker connection to those shared values, or there's more elevated sense of uncertainty or ambiguity in the way that our employees and people are talking about what success looks like or what a sense of belonging feels like, and so I think that that is probably the key indicator that tells us that cultural drift is afoot, and then I think there's, like, the component of like, what do you do about it? In
Yeah.
yeah.
Agree. I've seen it a lot when there's, leadership changes at the executive level in particular. Employees are left wondering kind of, what does the new leadership believe? And if it's not addressed and reinforced quickly, there can be just a ton of unanswered questions. So how can recognition help with some of those unanswered questions to really make it visible to employee outside of traditional messages from corporate communications and things like that, but so they can see it on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think of, like, features like the social feed or integrations into, different communication channels where each of those recognitions that happen kind like, think of it as social learning theory. Recognition platforms create this centralized forum where people can go and see they can learn new behaviors, values, and attitudes by watching others and watching what others are being recognized for. So that begins to form this, like, palpable, almost tangible indicator of the culture that an organization has. And then if we really have that commitment to recognition and we continuously and consistently praise the tenets like collaboration or agility or whatever those are in the moment, that then becomes this core tenet and guiding principle that people begin modeling because they see that what's been upheld is good examples and then they start to align themselves with those cultural expectations.
Yeah, I love that. I love the visibility beyond, what people would typically see in their day-to-day jobs. They can see what's happening in other departments, other locations, etcetera.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, as we've kind of talked about, if companies want more experimentation, learning, knowledge sharing, and those behaviors have to be seen and reinforced consistently, what advice would you give for leaders that want to get started without making this feel like something that is competing with all of the other things we talked about that are top of mind today?
Yeah, I'd say the best approach is starting small, but being really intentional or strategic about where you're starting. So, honing in and really understanding what are the behaviors that matter most in this transformation moment? What are the behaviors that are going to help us drive towards our goals and define what they look like in practice so that your leaders understand how to recognize them happening before they can go ahead and recognize the people. So having a common sense of shared language. It's this way that the goal isn't more noise, the goal becomes clearer signals. And so it's kind of like spending the time to define the inputs and recognizing the inputs that we believe will move the needle towards some of those outputs, like successful AI integration or insert KPI or OKR here.
Yeah, and I love we've highlighted a couple customer success stories here, and one's from Crumble Cookies and one's from Lineage. And they show that this work can happen across very different environments, from remote first teams to deskless workforces. What does that tell you about how adaptable this approach is?
I think it tells us that it's incredibly adaptable, that, like, the platform or the organizational context might differ, but people in every environment pay attention to what's recognized, what's rewarded, and therefore, as long as there's that commitment to spotlighting and shining a light on those moments, it then becomes reinforced. So highly flexible and adaptable.
Yeah, I love that. And how they administer and roll out their programs may vary, of course, so as they design for the different employee personas, but the results speak for themselves that it can go across industries, which is awesome. So as we bring this home, this is a big idea. Recognition is transformation infrastructure. It's not a nice to have, it's not something that's competing, but it's really part of the system that drives that change. If there's one thing that you would want the audience to remember, what would it be?
Yeah, how do we recap the last 50 minutes? I'd say that if you want transformation to be successful, you have to reinforce the human behaviors that make it possible. So, and in my mind, recognition is one of the clearest, most scalable ways to make that happen. It's not an not to think of it as or frame it as an additional lift. It's like this parallel processed like lever that you can use that's just going to make it easier long term in the successful nature of your initiative.
I love that. Thank you. All right, we're going to pop over back to see if we have some more audience questions. If you have additional questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll go through and see how many we have time to answer. Okay, we have one here. It says, "You mentioned an AI hackathon. Made me think of something like a recognition hackathon. Have we ever seen anything like that in practice?"
Oh, yes. What I'm thinking about when I read that, there's a lot of organizations that we partner with that do something. They don't necessarily brand it as a recognition hackathon. It's more in the spirit of Employee Appreciation Day or Employee Appreciation Week, where it really is a call to action across the organization to like get out your keyboards and pump as much recognition through the system to recognize your peers, your leaders, cross-functional partners. And there's a tremendous uptick in the recognitions that we see when those initiatives are intentionally promoted and thought through with communication in advance, maybe a reimagining of the values that you want to spend time bolstering and promoting. So I would say that's what pops into mind when I think recognition hackathon. It's like a employee appreciation day or week or spirit week initiative with the call to action of get in there and spotlight the great work that's happening.
Yeah, I love that. One of the organizations I worked at did kind of both. They did the traditional, there's like a calendar employee appreciation day. I think it's in April. And so we did that. And then we said one day is not enough to appreciate our employees. And then we celebrated a whole week later in the year. And it was very fun and it drove a ton of recognition as well as other employee engagement. Um, there's another question in here. Do you have any recommendations of how we can gather data that proves out the impact of recognition in our organization? I'll start and then I'll turn it over to you. And then we also have a lot of resources we could share after the fact. I put our LinkedIn information on introduction slide if anyone wants to connect with us. We can also source some of those questions as well. So I think the easiest place to start is to look at what you're already measuring today. It can be kind of daunting to try to think about new metrics and the work that goes into establishing new metrics, but look at what you're already measuring today. If you're measuring an ENPS or engagement survey results, if you're measuring turnover and retention, if you have safety metrics or quality metrics or any kind of other business outcomes, take an inventory of what you're measuring today and then look at your recognition data that you have and see if there's any correlation between those two things, and then use that to design what you want to measure over time. But I'm interested in your thoughts as well, Chantal.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. Wordco leverages a framework called the return on recognition, and we think about the output of measurements to defend the ROI through the lens of program culture and business outcomes, which like slots in very nicely with what you described. At a program level, you're looking at like how much administrative burden are my administrators or people who are sitting at the helm of these recognition like initiatives, regardless of if you have a platform. There might be gift cards in a desk somewhere. There might be, there's people who are at the helm of Spirit Week and those different initiatives. How much time are they spending? You touched on a little bit earlier about the power of reporting and that data visibility. When you have a lot of these disparate, unaligned, kind of creative solutions at play, what you don't have is that visibility. What am I spending? Where are people around the globe getting recognized? Who's missing out? And so, like, you can look at it through the lens of program, you can look at it through the lens of culture, which would include some of the things you described, like engagement survey results, sense of belonging, manager effectiveness. And then you can look at business outcomes like what is my overall attrition rate? What is my uh, customer satisfaction score? When we talk about customer satisfaction score, there's this whole philosophy of that when my people feel recognized and they do good work, and then therefore our end users are happy. And so it is really like taking inventory of what's currently at play and thinking it through those three dimensions and start a baseline measurement and then adapt and evolve your recognition strategy and see where you're moving the needle.